The microphone slipped in Ryan Cole's hand as he laughed, leaning over the polished table to steady himself. Champagne glasses clinked around him. The entire ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel buzzed with laughter. Ryan raised his glass again, grinning. "You all think tonight looks glamorous," he said, gesturing to the chandeliers and white roses decorating every table. "But trust me, my childhood didn't look anything like this." The guests chuckled politely. At the far back of the ballroom, Margaret Cole sat quietly at a small table near the wall. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers folded together. She had chosen the seat herself so she wouldn't draw attention. Ryan continued, his voice growing louder with confidence. "I grew up in a tiny apartment above a laundromat," he said. "The kind where the washing machines rattled the floor so hard you thought the whole place might collapse." Laughter rippled across the room. Ryan leaned closer to the microphone. "And let's just say, not everyone from that kind of place learns how to move on." More laughter. A few guests glanced toward the back of the room. Margaret lowered her eyes. Ryan kept talking. "You know how some people stay stuck in the same old habits," he said. "Same clothes, same stories, same small thinking." His best man slapped the table, laughing. Ryan lifted his glass toward the crowd. "Luckily, I figured out early that if I wanted a better life, I had to build it myself." The room burst into applause. Margaret felt the sound press against her chest. She stood slowly. No one noticed. Ryan was still speaking, basking in the laughter and admiration of his new family. Margaret walked toward the exit of the ballroom. The heavy doors closed softly behind her. Inside, the celebration continued. Outside, the night air felt cool against her face. She paused on the marble steps of the hotel. For a moment, she simply stood there. Then she whispered quietly to herself, "It's all right, Ryan." But her voice trembled. Years earlier, Ryan had been 8 years old when the front door slammed shut for the last time. Margaret stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty doorway. Her husband's car engine faded down the street. Ryan's small voice came from the hallway, "Mom." She wiped her face quickly before he walked in. "Where Dad going?" he asked. Margaret forced a smile. "He had to leave for a while." Ryan frowned, "Like work?" "Yes," she said softly, "like work." But even as she said it, she knew the truth. Bills covered the kitchen table. Past due notices, rent warnings, utility shut-off letters. Ryan picked up one of the envelopes. "Mom, why do these say red letters?" Margaret took it gently from his hand. "Don't worry about those," she said. "I'll take care of it." And she did. The next morning she woke before sunrise and started cleaning offices across town. In the afternoons, she worked at a grocery store. At night, she folded laundry at the laundromat downstairs. Ryan rarely saw her sleep. One night he sat at the kitchen table doing homework when Margaret walked in from work, her shoulders slumped. "Mom," he said, holding up a paper, "the teacher says I need a computer for the science project." Margaret froze for a moment. "How soon?" she asked. "Tomorrow." She smiled gently, "Then we'll figure it out." That night, after Ryan went to bed, Margaret opened a small wooden box in her closet. Inside was a gold ring. Her wedding ring. She turned it slowly in her fingers. The next afternoon, she walked out of a pawn shop with a receipt and just enough money for a used computer. Ryan never asked where it came from. Years later, he would proudly tell people he built his future from nothing. Margaret never corrected him. One evening, months after Ryan's father left, a letter arrived in the mail. Margaret sat at the kitchen table reading it carefully. Ryan walked in. "What is it?" She folded the paper quickly. "Just paperwork," she said. But the letter explained that a small insurance policy connected to Ryan's father had been paid out. It wasn't much, but it was something. Margaret stared at the number printed at the bottom of the page. Then she whispered, "Maybe this can grow." The next week she walked into a small financial office downtown. A young advisor greeted her politely. "How can I help you today?" Margaret slid the envelope across the desk. I don't understand much about investing, she admitted, but I want this money to last. The advisor studied the paperwork. It could grow over time, he said. How much time? Years. Margaret nodded slowly. That's all right, she said. My son has years. From that moment on, she checked the account every few months. Little by little, the numbers increased. Not dramatically, but steadily. Ryan grew older, smarter, more determined. By the time he finished high school, his grades were strong enough to earn admission to Brookhaven University. Ryan burst through the apartment door holding the acceptance letter. "Mom," he shouted, "I got in." Margaret hugged him tightly. Ryan laughed. "I did it." She smiled proudly. "Yes," she said softly, "you did." When the tuition bill arrived, Ryan stared at it in disbelief. "Mom, this is impossible." Margaret sat calmly across from him. "I've been saving," she said. Ryan frowned. "From the grocery store job." She nodded. Ryan shook his head in amazement. "You must be the best saver in the world." Margaret laughed quietly. "Something like that?" Ryan never knew the truth. Not when the tuition payments were made. Not when his rent was covered during his final semester. Not even when he received the small investment that helped him join a business startup after graduation. Every payment came from the same account Margaret had opened years earlier. But she never told him. Because when Ryan spoke about his success, his voice carried pride. And Margaret believed pride could be a powerful thing for a young man who once worried about red letters on bills. At Brookhaven University, Ryan's life changed. He met Vanessa Whitmore during a networking event. She introduced herself with an easy smile. "Ryan Cole, right? I've heard about your project presentation." Ryan blinked in surprise. "You have?" "My father runs Whitmore Industries," she said casually. "We pay attention to promising people." Ryan laughed nervously. "That sounds intimidating." Vanessa smiled. "It's actually an opportunity." Ryan soon found himself attending dinners in homes larger than anything he had ever imagined. Crystal glasses, marble floors, rooms that echoed with quiet wealth. During one dinner, Vanessa asked casually, "So where did you grow up?" Ryan hesitated. "Oh, a small neighborhood outside the city." Vanessa nodded politely. But Ryan noticed the way her friends talked about travel, private schools, family businesses. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of where he came from. He started making small adjustments. When Margaret called, he sometimes let the phone ring. When she asked to visit campus, he suggested waiting until he was less busy. One afternoon, she arrived unexpectedly carrying a bag of homemade food. Ryan met her outside the library. "Mom," he whispered urgently, "you shouldn't have come without telling me." She looked confused. "I thought it would be a nice surprise." Ryan glanced around nervously. "It's just people here are different." Margaret smiled kindly. "Different how?" Ryan rubbed the back of his neck. "They don't really understand our kind of life." Margaret nodded slowly. "I see." But she didn't argue. She handed him the food. "I made your favorite stew." Ryan forced a smile. "Thanks, Mom." Years later, when Ryan proposed to Vanessa, the Whitmore family hosted an engagement party at their estate. Margaret arrived wearing her best dress. Ryan greeted her at the door. "Mom," he whispered quietly, "maybe sit toward the back tonight." She looked surprised. "Why?" Ryan hesitated. "Just try not to tell too many old stories." Margaret studied his face. Then she nodded. "Of course." Now, standing outside the Grand Meridian Hotel on Ryan's wedding night, Margaret remembered that moment clearly. The ballroom doors behind her burst open as music swelled again. Guests continued celebrating inside. Margaret walked slowly across the parking lot. A black SUV rolled into the circular driveway nearby. The driver stepped out. "Mrs. Cole." She turned. "Yes." The car is ready whenever you are. Margaret looked back toward the glowing windows of the ballroom. Through the glass, she could see Ryan laughing with Vanessa and her family. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she whispered softly, "Give me a minute." Inside the ballroom, Ryan raised another glass. His best man leaned over. "That speech was brutal," he laughed. Ryan grinned. "Relax, it was just a joke." Vanessa nudged him playfully. "You definitely shocked a few people." Ryan shrugged. "They'll get over it." But near the entrance, guests began turning toward the doors. The music faded slightly. Ryan frowned. "What's going on?" The ballroom doors opened slowly. Margaret Cole stepped inside. But this time, something about her presence felt different. The room gradually fell quiet. Ryan blinked in confusion. "Mom," he said. Margaret walked calmly across the marble floor. Her voice carried gently through the room. "Ryan," she said. He shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, the reception is still." "I know," she said. Her eyes were steady. "May I borrow the microphone for a moment?" The room went completely silent. Ryan forced a small laugh. "Mom, this isn't really." Vanessa touched his arm. "Let her speak." Ryan hesitated. Then he handed Margaret the microphone. Margaret held it carefully. For a moment, she simply looked at the guests. Then she spoke. "I won't take long," she said quietly. Ryan shifted on his feet. Margaret continued. "When Ryan was 8 years old, his father left our home." The guests listened. Ryan looked uneasy. Margaret's voice remained calm. "We didn't have much after that," she said, "but we managed." Ryan forced a smile. "Mom." Margaret raised a gentle hand. "Please, Ryan, just a moment." He stopped speaking. Margaret continued. "A few months after his father left, I received a small insurance payment connected to an old policy." Ryan frowned. Margaret looked directly at him. "It wasn't a large amount," she said, "but I decided to invest it." The room remained silent. Ryan's confusion deepened. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Margaret met his eyes. "The money grew slowly over the years," she explained. "Not dramatically, but enough." Ryan's voice tightened. "Mom, what money?" Margaret answered softly. "The money that paid for your university tuition." Ryan stared. "The money that covered your rent during your last semester." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Margaret continued. "And the money that helped you join your first business venture after graduation." Ryan shook his head slowly. "No, that came from my savings." Margaret's voice remained calm. "No, Ryan." The ballroom felt frozen. "That came from the investment account I created when you were a child." Ryan's face drained of color. Vanessa looked between them in shock. Arthur Whitmore leaned forward in his chair. Ryan stepped closer to Margaret. "You're saying you paid for all of that?" Margaret nodded. Ryan's voice dropped. "Why didn't you tell me?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Because every time you spoke about your success, you sounded proud." She paused. "And I wanted you to feel that pride." The silence stretched across the ballroom. Margaret lowered the microphone slightly. "But tonight," she said gently, "I heard something else." Ryan swallowed. Margaret continued. "I heard my son laugh about the life that raised him." Her voice remained steady. "And I realized something important." Ryan whispered, "Mom." Margaret lifted the microphone again. "The financial trust I created for Ryan has supported many opportunities over the years." Guests exchanged stunned glances. Margaret finished calmly. "As of tonight, that support ends." Ryan stared at her. "What?" Margaret's eyes softened. "Success without respect is not something I wish to finance." Ryan's mouth opened, but no words came out. Margaret handed the microphone back to him. Then she turned toward the doors. The entire ballroom watched in silence as she walked away. Ryan stood frozen beneath the chandelier lights. For the first time that night, no one was laughing. And as the doors closed behind Margaret Cole, Ryan realized the truth he had spent years avoiding. The life he proudly claimed to build alone had been quietly built for him all along. Ryan stood frozen beneath the chandelier lights, the microphone still in his hand. The words his mother had spoken echoed in his head, repeating themselves over and over like a sound that refused to fade. The life he proudly claimed to build alone had been quietly built for him all along. The guests shifted in their seats, whispering softly to one another. Vanessa leaned toward him. "Ryan, what did she mean?" Ryan swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. I don't know," he muttered. But deep down, a strange uneasiness had already begun to settle inside him. Arthur Whitmore cleared his throat at the head table. "So," he said calmly, folding his hands together, "that was quite an unexpected announcement." Ryan forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "My mother likes drama sometimes," he said quickly. "I'm sure she exaggerated." But even as he spoke, doubt crept into his voice. Vanessa watched him carefully. "Ryan, did she really help pay for your college?" Ryan shook his head instinctively. "No, I mean she helped a little, but not like that." His best man leaned closer. "Man, if my mom had an investment fund like that, I'd be thanking her every day." Ryan's smile faded slightly. The music started again, hesitant at first, as the band tried to restore the mood. But the room felt different now. The laughter was quieter. The admiration Ryan had felt only minutes earlier had turned into something else. Something uncertain. Vanessa stood up slowly. "I'm going to check on her," she said. Ryan grabbed her wrist gently. "No, you don't have to do that." Vanessa frowned. "Ryan, she's your mother." "I know," he said quickly, "but she probably just needs some air." Arthur Whitmore spoke again, his voice calm but sharp. "You should go after her." Ryan looked at him. Arthur's expression was unreadable. Ryan hesitated. "I'll talk to her later," he said. But outside the Grand Meridian Hotel, Margaret Cole had already stepped into the waiting SUV. The driver closed the door behind her. "Where to, Mrs. Cole?" he asked politely. Margaret looked through the window at the glowing ballroom behind them. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then she said quietly, "Home." The car pulled away from the curb. Inside the ballroom, Ryan tried to laugh again. "All right, everyone," he said into the microphone, forcing his voice back into its earlier confidence. "Family surprises aside, let's get back to celebrating." Some guests clapped politely, but the energy in the room had shifted. Ryan could feel it. Vanessa sat down slowly beside him. "You didn't know about that investment?" she asked softly. Ryan shook his head. "No," he said. Vanessa studied him carefully, but she seemed very sure. Ryan rubbed his temple. "My mom always worried too much," he said. "She probably saved a little money and now she thinks it paid for everything." Arthur Whitmore leaned back in his chair. "Perhaps," he said, but something in his tone made Ryan uneasy. The evening continued, but the celebration felt strained. Ryan noticed the sideways glances, the quiet murmurs. At one point he overheard a guest whisper, "Did you hear what she said?" Another voice replied, "If that's true, that changes things." Ryan tried to ignore it, but the whispers followed him. By the time the reception ended, a heavy tension hung over the night. Later, Ryan and Vanessa sat in the back of a luxury sedan, heading toward their hotel suite. Vanessa looked out the window. "Ryan," she said carefully, "I think you should call her." Ryan stared straight ahead. "It's midnight," he said. "That's not the point." Ryan exhaled slowly. "She embarrassed me tonight." Vanessa turned toward him. "Ryan, you embarrassed her first." Her words landed harder than he expected. Ryan looked away. The car continued through the quiet streets of Brookhaven. Meanwhile, Margaret entered her small apartment building across town. The hallway lights flickered as she climbed the stairs. Inside her apartment, everything looked the same as it had for years. The same worn couch. The same kitchen table. The same wooden box in the closet. Margaret sat down slowly at the table. For a moment, she simply stared at the wall. Then she whispered softly, "I hope he understands someday." Across the city, Ryan stood inside the luxury hotel suite he had booked for his wedding night. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the skyline. Vanessa removed her earrings quietly. Ryan loosened his tie and poured himself a drink. Vanessa watched him. "You're angry," she said. Ryan took a long sip. "I worked hard for everything I have." Vanessa didn't argue, but she asked one question. "Did she?" Ryan frowned. "What do you mean?" Vanessa sat on the edge of the bed. "I mean, did she work hard for your life too?" Ryan didn't answer. The silence stretched between them. The next morning, Ryan woke early. Sunlight poured through the tall windows. Vanessa was still asleep. Ryan stood quietly and walked into the living room. He pulled out his phone. His thumb hovered over his mother's contact name. He hesitated. Then he put the phone down. Instead, he opened his laptop. His mind replayed her words. "The money that paid for your university tuition." Ryan shook his head. "No," he muttered. He opened his banking history. Then he opened the old email folders he had saved from college. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. Tuition statements. Payment confirmations. Account transfers. Ryan's breathing slowed. Every payment came from an account he didn't recognize. He opened one of the records. The account name appeared clearly on the screen. Margaret Cole Trust. Ryan leaned back in his chair. "No," he whispered. He clicked through another file. Then another. The same account. The same transfers. Year after year. Ryan felt the room spin slightly. Vanessa walked into the room, rubbing her eyes. "What are you doing up so early?" she asked. Ryan didn't answer. Vanessa stepped closer. "Ryan." He turned the laptop toward her. Vanessa read the screen. Her eyebrows lifted slowly. "Oh." Ryan ran a hand through his hair. "She never told me," he said. Vanessa looked at him carefully. "Did you ever ask?" Ryan didn't respond. Memories began pushing into his mind. His mother handing him the computer in high school. Her calm smile when the tuition bill arrived. Her quiet pride when he celebrated his achievements. Ryan whispered to himself, "I thought I did all of it." Vanessa sat down beside him. "Maybe she wanted you to believe that." Ryan closed the laptop slowly. His chest felt tight. "I made fun of her," he said quietly. Vanessa didn't try to soften the truth. "Yes," she said. Ryan stared out the window at the city. For the first time in years, the image he had built of himself began to crack. And somewhere across town, Margaret Cole was sitting quietly in her small kitchen, drinking her morning tea, unaware that the truth she had carried silently for decades had finally begun to reach her son. Ryan didn't touch his coffee. It sat on the glass table in the hotel suite, slowly losing its heat while he stared out at the skyline of Brookhaven. The city looked calm from 30 floors above the street, but inside his mind, everything felt unsettled. Vanessa stepped out of the bedroom, dressed for the morning. "You haven't moved," she said quietly. Ryan blinked as if waking from a trance. "I've been thinking." Vanessa crossed the room and sat across from him. "About your mom." Ryan nodded. "I checked the records again this morning," he said. "Every tuition payment, every rent transfer, even the seed money I used to invest in my first business project." He rubbed his face slowly. "It all came from that trust account." Vanessa folded her hands together. So she was telling the truth. Ryan let out a long breath. "Yeah." Silence filled the room. Then Vanessa asked gently, "Ryan, why did you make that speech last night?" Ryan leaned back in his chair. "I didn't think it was that bad." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "You compared your childhood to something people should escape from." Ryan shrugged defensively. "I was trying to show how far I'd come." Vanessa studied him carefully. But you made it sound like the people in that life were something to be ashamed of. Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Vanessa's voice softened. Your mother was sitting in that room. Ryan looked away. I know. He stood up and walked toward the window. You don't understand what it was like for me when I first met your family, he said quietly. Vanessa remained seated. Then explain it. Ryan turned around. Your world is different, he said. Your father owns half the companies in this city. Your friends grew up traveling across Europe. When they talk about their childhood homes, they're talking about estates. Vanessa listened. Ryan continued. And then there's me, the kid who grew up above a laundromat. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. And that's something you're ashamed of. Ryan hesitated. I didn't say that. But that's how it sounds. Ryan looked frustrated. You don't get it. Vanessa's voice sharpened slightly. No, Ryan, I think I do. He stared at her. Vanessa continued. You were afraid they would look down on you, so instead you decided to laugh at your past before anyone else could. Ryan didn't answer. The truth of her words hung between them. After a moment, Vanessa stood up. What are you going to do now? She asked. Ryan frowned. What do you mean? You heard what she said last night. She ended the trust. Ryan shrugged. I don't need it anymore. Vanessa crossed her arms. Maybe not financially. Ryan raised an eyebrow. What's that supposed to mean? Vanessa walked closer to him. It means this isn't just about money, Ryan. He sighed. I know. But his voice carried uncertainty. Vanessa studied him for a moment. Then she said quietly, you should go see her. Ryan hesitated again. I'll call her. Vanessa shook her head. No. Ryan frowned. What? She stood in front of an entire ballroom last night and told the truth about her life. The least you can do is show up in person. Ryan looked down at the floor. He hated admitting when someone else was right. But Vanessa rarely spoke this firmly unless she meant it. Fine, he said finally, I'll go today. Across town, Margaret Cole was standing behind the counter of a small community thrift shop. Sunlight streamed through the front window. She folded a stack of donated clothes carefully. Her coworker Diane watched her with curiosity. You didn't tell me your son was getting married yesterday, Diane said. Margaret smiled politely. I mentioned it a few weeks ago. Diane shrugged. I must have missed it. How was the wedding? Margaret paused for a moment. Then she continued folding. It was beautiful. Diane leaned against the counter. Those rich weddings are always something else. Margaret nodded. Yes, they are. Diane glanced at her again. You okay? Margaret looked up. Of course. But Diane knew her well enough to hear the quiet strain behind the words. You don't sound like someone who just watched her son get married. Margaret forced a small smile. I'm just tired. Diane didn't push further. Just then, the doorbell above the shop entrance chimed. Margaret looked up. Ryan stood in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them moved. Diane looked between them. Well, she muttered softly, I'll go check the back room. She slipped away quietly. Ryan stepped inside. The shop smelled faintly of detergent and old books. Margaret set the folded clothes down. Hello, Ryan. Her voice was calm. Ryan shifted awkwardly. Hi, Mom. Silence filled the space between them. Ryan rubbed the back of his neck. I saw the account records. Margaret nodded slightly. I thought you might. Ryan glanced around the small shop. You work here? A few days a week. Ryan frowned. You don't need to. Margaret smiled gently. I like staying busy. Ryan took a few slow steps toward the counter. Why didn't you tell me? Margaret tilted her head slightly. I thought I explained that last night. Ryan exhaled sharply. No, Mom, I mean all those years. Why keep it a secret? Margaret folded another shirt slowly. Because I didn't want you to feel like you owed your success to anyone. Ryan leaned forward. But I did owe it to you. Margaret shook her head softly. You earned your education, you worked hard, you made opportunities for yourself. Ryan's voice rose slightly. But you paid for it. Margaret met his eyes. Yes. Ryan ran his hand through his hair. That changes everything. Margaret smiled sadly. Only if you let it. Ryan stared at her. Mom, I made fun of our life. Margaret's expression remained gentle. Yes. Ryan swallowed. In front of everyone. Margaret nodded. Yes. Ryan looked down at the floor. I didn't think you'd care. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, Ryan, every parent hopes their child will grow into someone successful. Ryan looked up slowly. But more than that, she continued, we hope they grow into someone kind. The words hit him harder than any accusation. Ryan whispered, Are you angry with me? Margaret thought for a moment. No, she said. Ryan blinked in surprise. I'm disappointed. Ryan felt the weight of the words settle over him. Disappointed. It sounded softer than anger. But somehow it hurt more. Ryan leaned against the counter. I didn't realize how much you did for me. Margaret smiled faintly. You weren't supposed to. Ryan shook his head slowly. But now I do. Margaret studied him carefully. What are you going to do with that knowledge? Ryan didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked quietly, Did you really end the trust? Margaret nodded. Yes. Ryan exhaled. That account was still growing, wasn't it? Margaret didn't deny it. Ryan asked softly, How much was left? Margaret looked at him with calm eyes. Enough to change someone's life. Ryan stared at her. And for the first time since walking into the shop, he realized something. His mother had never cared about the money. But he suddenly did. And Margaret could see it in his eyes. Ryan stared at his mother across the thrift shop counter, the quiet hum of the ceiling fan filling the silence between them. Enough to change someone's life, he repeated slowly. Margaret simply nodded. Ryan rubbed his chin, thinking, That must be a lot of money. Margaret didn't respond right away. Instead, she continued folding the shirt in front of her, smoothing the fabric carefully. Ryan watched her hands. The same hands that had worked late nights at the laundromat. The same hands that had packed his school lunches. The same hands that had quietly built the investment account he had only learned about yesterday. Mom, he said cautiously, you could have told me. Margaret looked up. Would it have changed anything? Ryan hesitated. I don't know. Margaret gave a small, knowing smile. I think it would have. Ryan leaned his elbows on the counter. You really ended it. Yes. Completely. Yes. Ryan exhaled slowly. That account helped me get where I am. Margaret's voice remained gentle. And now you're somewhere good, aren't you? Ryan nodded. Of course. Then the account served its purpose. Ryan looked frustrated. That's not the point. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Then what is the point? Ryan opened his mouth. But again, the answer didn't come. Before he could respond, the shop door chimed. Diane walked back out from the storage room carrying a box of books. She paused when she saw the tension between them. Oh, she said awkwardly, should I come back later? Margaret shook her head. No, it's all right. Diane placed the box on the table. Ryan glanced at her. So you work with my mom? Diane smiled politely. Couple days a week. Ryan looked around the modest shop again. You like this place? He asked Margaret. I do. Ryan frowned. But you could be living somewhere nicer. Margaret laughed softly. Ryan, I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. It's home. Ryan shook his head. You don't have to struggle anymore. Margaret's expression remained calm. I never thought of it as struggling. Ryan sighed, clearly frustrated. You worked 3 jobs when I was a kid. Margaret shrugged. Many parents do. Ryan's voice rose slightly. You sold your wedding ring to buy me a computer. Margaret froze for a moment. Ryan noticed. You thought I didn't know. Margaret looked surprised. You remembered that? Ryan nodded slowly. I was 14. Margaret smiled faintly. I suppose children notice more than we think. Ryan leaned back, thinking again. That investment account, he said. How big did it get? Margaret folded another shirt. Ryan pressed. Millions. Margaret didn't answer. Ryan let out a small laugh. Well, Diane glanced between them awkwardly. Maybe I should check the back again, she murmured. Margaret waved her hand gently. No need. Ryan tapped the counter. So what happens to the money now? Margaret looked directly at him. Why do you ask? Ryan shrugged. Just curious. Margaret studied his face carefully. Ryan, are you asking because you're worried about me? Ryan hesitated. Well, yeah. Margaret's eyes softened slightly. That's kind of you. But then she added quietly, I'll be fine. Ryan frowned. That's not what I meant. Margaret folded the last shirt and set it aside. Then what did you mean? Ryan shifted uncomfortably. That money was meant for my future. Margaret didn't respond immediately. Diane slowly stepped away from the counter, pretending to organize books while clearly listening. Ryan continued. I built plans around it. Margaret looked puzzled. What kind of plans? Ryan spoke carefully. Expanding the company, new investments. Margaret blinked. You were planning to use the trust money for business. Ryan nodded. Well, yeah. Margaret leaned back slightly. Ryan, the trust supported your education and early opportunities. Ryan shrugged. And it was still growing. Margaret's voice remained calm but firm. That doesn't mean it belongs to you forever. Ryan frowned. I thought that was the whole idea. Margaret shook her head slowly. No. Ryan crossed his arms. So what happens to it now? Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the small desk in the corner of the shop. She opened a drawer and pulled out a thin folder. Ryan watched carefully. Margaret returned and placed the folder on the counter. Ryan looked down at it. What's that? A letter from the trust advisor. Ryan opened the folder slowly. Inside were documents and printed statements. He flipped through them quickly. The numbers made his eyebrows rise. Mom, this is way more than I thought. Margaret remained quiet. Ryan looked up. You've been letting this grow for over 20 years. Yes. Ryan stared at the page again. This is life-changing money. Margaret smiled gently. I know. Ryan closed the folder slowly. So who gets it? Margaret looked around the shop. Then she said something that made Ryan blink. It's already been allocated. Ryan frowned. What do you mean? Margaret pointed toward the window. Across the street, a small building with a faded sign stood on the corner. Ryan squinted. What's that? Margaret answered quietly. The Brookhaven Youth Learning Center. Ryan looked confused. Okay, and? Margaret folded her hands together. I donated the trust to them last night. Ryan froze. What? Margaret repeated calmly. The funds will create scholarships for children who grow up in neighborhoods like the one you came from. Ryan stared at her in disbelief. You gave it away. Margaret nodded. Yes. Ryan's voice rose. Mom, that was my trust. Margaret shook her head gently. No, Ryan. Her eyes were steady. It was never yours. Ryan slammed the folder shut. That money could have helped my company expand. Margaret's voice stayed calm. It already helped your life expand. Ryan paced across the shop, clearly agitated. You didn't even talk to me first. Margaret watched him quietly. You didn't talk to me before making fun of our life in front of hundreds of people. Ryan stopped packing. The words hit him again. Margaret continued softly. You wanted to show everyone how far you had risen. Ryan said nothing. Margaret gestured toward the window again. Now that money will help other children rise too. Ryan's jaw tightened. That was my opportunity. Margaret shook her head. No. Ryan looked at her, anger and confusion mixing in his voice. Then what was it? Margaret answered quietly. It was my sacrifice. The shop fell silent again. Ryan stood there, staring at the woman he had spent years trying to distance himself from. For the first time in his life, he realized something unsettling. The power in the room had shifted. Not because of money, but because his mother had never needed it to stand tall. And suddenly Ryan Cole felt smaller than he ever had before. Ryan stood in the middle of the thrift shop, the thin folder still clutched tightly in his hand. The anger that had rushed through him moments ago now felt tangled with something heavier. Confusion, regret, and a growing sense of shame he couldn't push away. You donated everything, he said slowly, as if saying the words again might somehow change them. Margaret nodded calmly. Yes. Ryan ran a hand over his face and let out a long breath. That money could have changed my company's future. Margaret looked at him gently. It already changed yours. Ryan shook his head. That's not the same. Margaret didn't argue. She simply watched him, the same way she used to watch him when he struggled with homework as a boy, waiting patiently for him to figure things out on his own. Ryan placed the folder back on the counter. So that's it, he asked. Everything is just gone. Margaret folded her hands. Gone for you, she said softly, but not gone for everyone. Ryan glanced toward the window again at the small youth center across the street. Children were gathering outside, laughing and running across the sidewalk. He frowned. You gave them all of it. Yes. Ryan exhaled slowly. You didn't even keep a portion for yourself. Margaret smiled faintly. I've never needed much. Ryan looked around the modest shop again. The worn shelves, the faded paint on the walls, the old wooden counter. You could have lived differently, he said. Margaret tilted her head slightly. I lived the way I chose. Ryan leaned against the counter again, quieter now. When I was a kid, he said slowly, I thought you were the strongest person I knew. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Only when you were a kid. Ryan let out a small, embarrassed laugh. I guess somewhere along the way, I started believing strength looked different. Margaret didn't respond. Ryan looked at her. I thought it looked like success. Margaret's eyes softened. And now? Ryan hesitated. I'm not sure anymore. The shop door chimed again as a few customers stepped inside, browsing quietly through the racks of clothes. Margaret greeted them politely before turning back to Ryan. You're welcome to stay, she said gently, but I do have work to finish. Ryan nodded slowly. Right. He stood there for another moment, unsure what to say next. Finally, he spoke. I really hurt you last night, did I? Margaret thought about it. Yes. Ryan swallowed. I'm sorry. Margaret looked at him carefully, studying his face. I know. Ryan blinked. You know. Margaret nodded. You were always quick to apologize when you were little. Ryan looked surprised. You remember that? Of course. Ryan shifted awkwardly. I guess I forgot how to do it properly. Margaret smiled faintly. That happens when people get busy trying to prove themselves. Ryan glanced down at the floor. Vanessa said something like that this morning. Margaret raised an eyebrow. She sounds wise. Ryan chuckled softly. She usually is. He paused before adding quietly, she told me to come see you. Margaret nodded. I'm glad you did. Ryan hesitated again. Even after everything. Margaret gave a small shrug. Ryan, you're still my son. Ryan looked at her for a long moment. You know, he said slowly, when I stood at that microphone last night, I thought everyone in that room admired me. Margaret listened quietly. Ryan continued. I thought they saw someone who had climbed out of a hard life and built something impressive. Margaret folded another shirt carefully. And what do you think they saw after I spoke? Ryan sighed. Someone who forgot where he came from. Margaret didn't deny it. Ryan shook his head. I spent years trying to distance myself from our past. Margaret spoke softly. Why? Ryan looked at the window again. Because I thought people like the Whitmores wouldn't respect it. Margaret's voice was calm. Did Vanessa ever say that? Ryan hesitated. No. Did her father? Ryan shook his head again. No. Margaret tilted her head. Then whose voice were you really listening to? Ryan didn't answer. The question settled heavily in his mind. After a moment he said quietly, maybe my own. Margaret smiled gently. That voice can be the harshest one. Ryan looked at her again. You really believe those kids across the street will benefit from that money? Margaret nodded without hesitation. Yes. Ryan watched the children laughing outside. They remind me of you, Margaret added. Ryan looked surprised. Me? You used to run around just like that when you were young. Ryan smiled faintly at the memory. I forgot about that. Margaret's voice softened. I never did. Ryan took a deep breath. You know something strange. What? Ryan gestured toward the youth center. I spent my whole life thinking the goal was to leave that kind of neighborhood behind. Margaret waited. Ryan continued. But maybe the goal was supposed to be helping someone else get out too. Margaret's smile widened slightly. That sounds like a lesson worth learning. Ryan laughed quietly. You always did teach me things in unexpected ways. Margaret shrugged. I never planned the lessons. Ryan looked around the shop one more time. You're really happy here, aren't you? Margaret nodded. I am. Ryan shook his head with a small smile. You're incredible, Mom. Margaret raised an eyebrow playfully. That's not something I hear often. Ryan chuckled. Well, maybe I should say it more. Margaret glanced at the clock on the wall. Your wife is probably wondering where you are. Ryan checked his phone. 3 missed calls from Vanessa. He sighed. She definitely is. Margaret smiled. You should go. Ryan nodded. But before leaving, he paused at the door. Mom. Yes. Ryan looked back at her. I don't know if I can undo what happened last night. Margaret folded another shirt calmly. You can't. Ryan swallowed. But I can try to be better. Margaret met his eyes. That's all anyone can do. Ryan stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight. Across the street, the children were still laughing outside the youth center. One boy kicked a worn soccer ball toward the sidewalk. Ryan watched for a moment. Then he walked across the street. Margaret noticed from the shop window. She watched as Ryan bent down, picked up the ball and tossed it back to the children. The kids cheered and ran after it. Ryan laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in years. Margaret smiled quietly to herself. For the first time in a long time, her son didn't look like a man trying to escape his past. He looked like someone finally beginning to understand it. And sometimes, Margaret thought as she returned to folding clothes, understanding was the first real step toward becoming the person you were always meant to be.